She was 20 years old, and she had $3 and a brass spyglass that had belonged to her great-grandfather, and on the morning this story begins, she paid the $3 for the right to something that every person in the county could see, and no person in 80 years had wanted: a single ore cart, hanging on a dead cable 400 feet above the floor of Gallows Gorge, still loaded, exactly where it had stopped on the night the Kestrel tramway failed in 1849. Her name was Alma Rusk, and she was the last of a disgraced family, and she was the only living soul who had ever thought to ask the question that this story turns on. Everyone in the county knew the hanging cart. It was the landmark of that country, the thing strangers were taken to see, the thing children were told about. The last bucket of the old Kestrel aerial tramway hung out over the deepest part of the gorge on its rusted cable, heaped with ore, swinging a little in the wind for 80 years, too high to reach and too worthless to bother with, for it was full of rock. That was the joke of it, the reason nobody ever went after it. A treasure hangs unreachable over a gorge, and a country will spend 100 years scheming at it. A cart of common ore hangs there, and the country simply admires the view. 80 years of miners and engineers and idle boys had looked up at the hanging cart of Gallows Gorge and seen a load of rock. Not one of them had ever asked what was under it. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Alma Rusk, and the minecart that hung 80 years over the gorge, and the thing that lay beneath the ore. And if a story of a cheated family and a patient eye is what you came for tonight, light a lantern with us, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what part of this wide country you are watching from. We are always glad of the company here in the dark. To understand the question Alma asked, you have to understand what her family had been, and what was done to it, and what an ore cart is actually for. The Kestrel mine had been the making of that district, high in the Colorado mountains, a silver mine of extraordinary richness in its first years. And the problem of the Kestrel had always been the gorge. The ore came out of the mountain on one side of Gallows Gorge, and the mill that crushed and treated it stood on the other, and between them lay 400 feet of empty air and a road so long and so bad that hauling by wagon ate the profit of every ton. So the company had built an aerial tramway, a marvel of its day, 2 great towers, a span of standing cable across the gorge, and a train of iron buckets that ran out from the mine side heavy and came back light, the loaded weight of the ore going down the wire, doing the work of hauling the empties back up. Every ounce of the Kestrel's wealth crossed that gorge hanging on a wire. And the whole system, the whole fortune of the district, depended on one small honest office at the mine end of the tram, the weighhouse and assay room, where the ore was weighed and sampled and its worth recorded before it ever went out on the wire. The man who kept that office for 18 years was Emil Rusk, and he was Alma's great-grandfather, and he was, by every account that survived, exactly the man such a job requires: careful, cold, incorruptible, a trained assayer who could read a sample of rock the way a doctor reads a pulse, and who kept the Kestrel's books to the grain. He had come from Saxony with the training in his hands, and he had raised his family in the tramhouse cottage above the gorge, and he had taught his own daughter, as such men did, the whole science of his trade, because he had no son, and the knowledge was the only fortune he had to give. And in the autumn of 1849, the Kestrel accused Emil Rusk of theft, and ruined him, and the ruin has lain on his family for 80 years. The charge was high grading. That is the mining word for the oldest crime in the trade, the stealing of the richest ore, the high grade. The pockets of stuff so rich that a man's coat pockets full of it are worth a year's wages. High grading was the plague of every rich mine, and the Kestrel had it badly in its last 2 years. The mill's returns kept coming in below what the mine's own assays promised, ton after ton. A bleeding of the richest values that no one could account for. Somewhere between the weighhouse and the mill, the best of the Kestrel's ore was going missing. And the company's superintendent, a large and popular and forceful man named Judd Ostrander, laid the loss at the door of the weigh-house, and the man who kept it. It was, he told the directors, plain. The assays came out of Rusk's office, the ore went out of Rusk's office, only Rusk knew which lots ran richest, and if the mill kept receiving less than the assays promised. Then the assays were false, or the ore was tampered, and either way there was one hand on both. Emil Rusk protested. He had his books kept in his own careful hand, and the books were honest. And he showed them, and was told that a thief's own books prove nothing. He asked for the mill's returns to be laid beside his assays lot by lot, so that where the loss occurred could be found. He was refused. He asked, at the last, for a special assay of the buckets in transit to prove that what left his weigh-house was what his books said it was, and Judd Ostrander told him, in front of the office, that no more of the company's money would be spent proving a thief innocent, and dismissed him, and blackened him through every mine in the district. And there was not a man in the mountains who would give work to an assayer accused of high-grading. Emil Rusk did not have long to fight it, for that same autumn the great storm came that finished the Kestrel. The tramway went out on a November night, a wind that tore the mountain, and one of the towers was thrown down, and the whole train of buckets on the wire fell into Gallows Gorge and burst on the rocks 400 feet below, all but one, the last bucket, which was out over the deepest span and which stopped when the cable slackened and hung and hangs still. The tramway was ruined, and the Kestrel's best ore was worked out by then, and the company, which had been rich, went into liquidation within the year and abandoned the whole works, mine and mill and towers and cottage and the one hanging bucket, and the district went quiet, and Judd Ostrander, who had been superintendent, left the county for the East a wealthy man, admired for his firm handling of a difficult mine. And Emil Rusk stayed, poor and broken, and never got another day's work at his trade, and lived 9 years more in the tram house cottage the abandoned company forgot to evict him from, looking out every day at the ruined tramway and the one bucket hanging out over the gorge. And he died there, and his family stayed poor, 3 generations of them, the kin of the assayer who stole from the Kestrel, and the name of Rusk in that county meant thief the way the name of a hanged man means the gallows. And it was still true 80 years later when the last of the line, Alma Rusk, was left an orphan at 19 and turned out of a boarding house at 20 for a week's owed rent. She had almost nothing. She had the family's one keepsake, Emil Rusk's brass spyglass, kept because it was the only fine thing they had ever owned. And she had what could not be sold or taken, and had come down the female line of that family like an heirloom, taught mother to daughter for 80 years in kitchens and back rooms, with no laboratory and no reason and no hope of ever using it. Emil Rusk's trade. Alma Rusk could read rock. She had been shown ores and country stones since she was small, been made to name them, been taught the colors and weights and fracture of 100 minerals by a mother who had been taught by a grandmother who had been taught by the disgraced assayer himself, and who had all of them held to the belief, passed down with the knowledge, that Emil Rusk had never stolen an ounce in his life. It had seemed, to Alma as a child, the most useless education a poor girl was ever given. No woman in that county would be hired to assay anything. The knowledge had no place to go. It was simply handed down, generation to generation, the way a family keeps a key to a house it no longer owns. And it was that knowledge, the useless inherited trade of a family with no laboratory, that made Alma Rusk the one person in 80 years to look at the hanging cart of Gallows Gorge and see something wrong. She had gone out to the gorge in the first bad week after she lost her room, because she had nowhere else to go, and the abandoned tram house cottage where her great-grandfather had died was still standing, roofless in part but standing, and squatting in it was better than sleeping out. And in the long empty days there, with nothing to do and no work to be had, she had taken to sitting on the gorge lip with Emil Rusk's brass spyglass, looking at the thing her family had looked at for 80 years, the last bucket, out on the wire, heaped with its load. And on the 3rd or 4th day of looking, Alma Rusk sat up straight and said, aloud, to nobody, that is the wrong rock. She looked for an hour more to be certain, and she was certain. The load heaped in the hanging bucket, seen close through good glass in the flat morning light, was not kestrel ore. It was country rock. Waste, the barren gray-green stuff of the formation the kestrel drove through to reach its silver, a rock any child of that district could name at a glance, and Emil Rusk's great-granddaughter could name from 400 feet with a spyglass, because she had been taught to know it the way other children are taught the alphabet. And that was nonsense. That was the thing that made her heart start to knock. Because a tramway bucket is not a wheelbarrow, it does not carry whatever happens to be handy. The kestrel's tram existed for exactly one purpose, to carry weighed and assayed ore from the weighhouse across to the mill. And its buckets went out full of ore and came back empty, and that was all they ever did in 18 years. Waste rock was never sent across the gorge. It could not be. It was worthless, and the mill had no use for it, and hauling it out on the wire would have been like a bank paying to ship crates of gravel to its own vault. Waste rock went on the dump at the mine 30 steps away. In the entire life of the Kestrel tramway, not one bucket of barren country rock had ever crossed Gallows Gorge, because there was no reason on earth to send one, unless the rock was not the cargo. Unless the rock was a lid. Alma Rusk sat on the lip of the gorge with the spyglass in her lap and worked it through, and the whole shape of her family's ruin turned over and showed its other side. If a man wished to move something out of the kestrel that must not be seen, he could not carry it past the weighhouse, because the weighhouse was kept by an incorruptible Saxon who weighed and sampled everything that moved. But the weighhouse only troubled itself with ore. And what if a bucket went out that was, on its face, not ore at all, a bucket of plain waste, of no value and no interest, that no honest assayer would think to sample and no thief would think to rob? What if you filled such a bucket a foot deep with the richest high grade in the mountain, and then covered it over with a foot of barren gray gravel, and sent it across the gorge at the end of a shift, and had a man on the millside to take it off quietly before the orehouse crew came on? You would have carried a fortune in stolen silver straight past the only honest man in the district, in plain sight, in the company's own bucket, on the company's own wire, and the honest man would take the blame for the losses forever, because the losses would appear exactly where he stood. It was the perfect crime. And it had worked for 2 years. And it had ruined Emil Rusk, and the very last bucket of it, loaded on the afternoon before the great November storm, and never taken off at the far end, had been hanging 400 feet over Gallows Gorge for 80 years, while an entire county admired the view, and never once asked why a silver tramway would ship a load of worthless gravel. She had, then, an answer, and no proof, which is the condition her great-grandfather had died in, and Alma Rusk had no intention of dying in it. She wanted the bucket. She went to the county and found that the whole abandoned kestrel works had long since fallen to the county for taxes and been sold off piecemeal, the mill for scrap, the buildings for their lumber, and that what remained on the books was a scattering of unsold worthless items, and among them listed with an 80-year-old clerk's dry humor, 1 iron tram bucket, contents rock, location aerial, condition suspended, $3. The clerk laughed when she paid it. She let him. She had learned early that the world's laughter is loudest just before it goes quiet, and she signed her name, Rusk, the thief's name, on the paper that made the hanging bucket and everything in it hers in law. Getting to it took her 4 months, and she did it alone, and she did it with paper before she ever did it with rope. For Alma Rusk did not begin by climbing. She began in the ruin of the tram house, in the collapsed office where her great-grandfather had kept his books, and she dug through 80 years of fallen roof and rat-chewed rubbish for 2 weeks until she found what she had reasoned must be there, the tramway's own engineering papers. The company's plans and specifications for the aerial line, wrapped in oiled canvas in a fallen cabinet, mildewed and stained but readable. And Alma sat down in the cottage where her great-grandfather had died and taught herself, over the winter by lamplight, how an aerial tramway is built. She learned the parts and their names. She learned that the great standing cable, the track cable on which the buckets ran, was not the cable that had failed. The plans showed the track cable anchored in rock on both sides, independent of the towers, and it was the fallen tower and the traction rope that had wrecked the line, which was why the track cable still hung across the gorge, sagging but whole and anchored, 80 years on. She learned the specification of that cable and what it had been built to carry. 6 loaded buckets at once, which was more than 20 tons, so that the weight of one small woman was nothing to it. Less than nothing if the wire were still sound. And she learned, from a drawing on the 4th sheet, the thing that made the whole plan possible, that the Kestrel line, like every good tramway of its day, had carried a traveler, a maintenance carriage, a little 4-wheeled trolley with a hanging seat that ran on the track cable and let a lineman go out over the span to grease the rollers and free a stuck bucket. And she learned where they had kept it. She found the traveler in the wreck of the tower house, under a fallen wall, rusted into a solid mass, but complete, and she spent the rest of that winter bringing it back to life. She had no forge and no money. She had penetrating oil made of coal oil and tallow, and a hammer and her great-grandfather's tool roll, and time, which is the poor person's only surplus, and she worked at the seized wheels of that little carriage for 11 weeks, oiling and tapping and turning and oiling again, an hour at a time, day after day through the snow, until the first wheel broke free, and then the second, and by the thaw all 4 wheels ran true, and the frame was sound. And the hanging seat, which she rebuilt with new webbing of her own weaving, was ready. And she tested the cable. She was her great-grandfather's blood. She would not stake her life on a hope. She walked the anchorages on both sides over the frozen weeks, and dug them out and examined them, the great iron shoes bedded in the granite, and found them sound. She hauled herself hand over hand a few feet out and back on the wire at a place where the ground was close beneath, and watched how it took her weight. She sounded the cable's whole visible length with her eyes and the spyglass, foot by foot, looking for the broken strands that would show a wire near failing, and she found the line rusted and stiff but unbroken. The fat old iron rope of a rich company's best years, built for 20 tons and asked, now for 110 pounds. And on a still morning in April, when the wind lay quiet in Gallows Gorge, Alma Rusk hung her great-grandfather's spyglass around her neck and buckled herself into the seat of the traveler and went out on the wire. She would tell it, ever after, as the longest half-hour of her life. The gorge came up under her by inches as the ground fell away and the wire began its sag toward the middle of the span, and the world went quiet the way it does at height. And the little carriage creaked, and the wheels sang on the rusted cable, and the wind, which was nothing at all on the rim, was a live thing 400 feet up, pushing her seat in small, cold shoves. She did not look down for the first 100 feet, and then she made herself look, because her great-grandfather had raised a family that did not pretend, and she looked down at the tumbled rock and the white water so far below, and the wrecked buckets of 1849 still lying broken among the boulders where they had fallen. And she went on, hauling herself along the wire hand over hand, out over the deepest part of Gallows Gorge, to the hanging bucket. It was bigger, up close, than 80 years of looking had made it. A great riveted iron tub the size of a bathtub hung on its yoke from the wheeled carriage that gripped the cable, rusted to the color of dried blood, absolutely still now that she was against it, and heaped to its rim with gray-green barren rock. Alma Rusk hung beside it in her seat, breathing. 400 feet over the gorge, and put out her hand and touched the load, and it was exactly what she had known it was from the rim. Waste rock, worthless, the discard of the Kestrel's driving, the lid on her great-grandfather's ruin. And she began, with a small hand trowel, to take it off. She would not simply tip the bucket. She needed what was under the rock to fall 400 feet into a river even less than she needed to fall herself, and besides, she had a proof to preserve and not merely a treasure to grab. So she worked the way an assayer's blood works, carefully, filling a canvas bag with the waste and lowering it on a line to hang below her, and taking off the barren rock a trowelful at a time until, a foot down, the color changed. It changed the way a lie changes when it ends. Beneath the flat gray-green of the waste, dry and untouched under its 80-year lid, the load of that bucket turned suddenly, gorgeously, unmistakably rich, heavy dark ore shot through with the wire silver and the ruby dark glitter that any child of a silver district learns to dream of, high grade, the best of the best, the ore a mine sees a few times in its life, packed a foot deep in the bottom of a bucket that 80 years of onlookers had called a load of gravel. Alma Rusk, hanging on a wire in the middle of the sky, found herself laughing and crying at once, which she said afterward was not a dignified way to be vindicated, but was the way it happened. And, under the high grade, wrapped in oilcloth and laid flat on the iron bottom of the bucket where no assay and no accident would ever have found them, were the books. They were Judd Ostrander's, and they were the second set. Every high grader who steals at scale must keep an accounting, for a thief cannot trust his confederates without a tally, and Ostrander had kept his in a small green ledger, and the ledger recorded, in his own hand and initialed by his own men, 2 years of it, the dates of the disguised shipments, the weights, the assays of what the covered buckets truly carried, the names of the mill-side men who took them off and the amounts they were paid, and the running total of what had been carried out of the kestrel under a foot of gravel. He had been sending the books across, too. It was, Alma understood later, exactly what a careful criminal would do on that last afternoon, the storm coming, the district talking, a dismissed assayer making noise, the smart move to get the ledger off the mine site and into his own keeping across the gorge, in the safest, most invisible carrier he had, the bucket nobody ever looked at. And then the wind had taken the tower down, and Judd Ostrander's own accounting of his own crime had hung 400 feet over Gallows Gorge for 80 years while he lived rich and admired in the East and died in his bed. Alma Rusk brought it all in. It took her 4 more days on the wire, bag by careful bag, and she brought in the high grade and the ledger and the oilcloth and even the waste rock, every ounce of that bucket's contents. Because she had grown up in the shadow of a man ruined by an accusation, and she was not going to hand the county a story with a single, unweighed pound in it. And then she did the thing her great-grandfather had been refused 80 years before, and she did it in public. She took the ore and the ledger to the county seat and swore out her account before the court, and she asked for the one thing Emil Rusk had asked for and been denied, a full and independent assay formally witnessed. And this time it was granted, because a young woman standing in a courthouse with a green ledger and 400 pounds of stolen high grade is a harder thing to wave off than a poor employee asking his employer for a favor. 3 assayers of the state's own choosing tested the ore. It ran, they reported, at a value that made the courtroom murmur, and it matched, lot for lot and grade for grade. The entries recorded in Judd Ostrander's green ledger, which was itself proved genuine by a dozen surviving samples of his hand in the county's own records of the Kestrel Company. And so, in a single week, 80 years late, the thing came out entire. The Kestrel's losses had not come from the weighhouse. They had gone out across the gorge under a lid of waste rock, by the hand of the superintendent who had invented the accusation against his own assayer to explain the very losses he was causing, and who had chosen, for his scapegoat, the one man in the works too honest to be recruited and too careful to be fooled for long. Emil Rusk had been ruined precisely because he was incorruptible. That was the finding of the court, set down in the record, and the newspapers of the district carried it, and the story ran through those mountains as such stories do. Judd Ostrander was 50 years dead and beyond any law. But his name in that county, which had been the name of the firm's superintendent who cleaned up a thieving mine, became instead the name of the man who robbed the Kestrel and hanged his crime on an honest man for 80 years, and the Ostrander family, who had a bank and a street named for them 2 states away, found the story following them there, as such stories do now that they are written down. and the name of Rusk, which had meant thief in that county since 1849, was cleared in open court. And the district, which is to say the grandchildren of the people who had shunned him, discovered all at once that it had always suspected there was something wrong with that old business. The ore was Alma's, clean and clear. She had bought the bucket and its contents for $3 in a lawful sale, and the Kestrel Company had been dissolved for 80 years. And no living claimant stood against her. The high grade of that last bucket, at the value the state's assayers set on it, was a fortune. She was not poor any more, and never was again. And what Alma Rusk built with it was the thing that told you what she was. She did not leave the district. She took her great-grandfather's fortune, which is what she always called it, and she built in that mountain town a public assay office, endowed forever, with a licensed assayer and a certified scale, free to any working miner in the district who wished a sample tested or a load weighed by a hand that no company paid. For she had understood, better than anyone alive, what the whole tragedy of her family had turned on. That, in a mining country, the person who holds the scale and the assay holds everyone's fate, and that when that person answers to the company, the honest are helpless. The Rusk-free assay stood in that town for 60 years, and there were 3 generations of miners in those mountains who never once had to take a company's word for what their ore was worth. And it is not too much to say that it was the single most useful building in the county. Alma Rusk kept the Traveler, the little rusted carriage she had brought back to life, with tallow and 11 weeks of patience, and hung it on the wall of the assay office where the miners could see it. And she kept, on the desk, under glass, the brass spyglass, and beside it a small tray holding 2 pieces of rock, a lump of barren gray-green country stone, and a lump of the high grade that had lain beneath it. She would show it to anyone who asked, and to a good many who did not. She had been 20 years old, and orphaned, and turned out of a boarding house over a week's rent, and she had spent her last $3 on a load of worthless gravel hanging 400 feet over a gorge that 10,000 people had looked at for 80 years and admired. It was the best $3 she ever spent. There is a thing worth carrying out of a story like this one, and it is not the silver, though the silver bought a good thing. It is that the best hiding place in this world has never been the deep hole or the locked box. It is the boring thing in plain sight. Judd Ostrander did not hide his fortune where it could not be found. He hid it where no one would trouble to look, under a lid of the most uninteresting substance in the district, and it worked so perfectly that his crime hung in full view of an entire county, at the exact center of its favorite landmark, for 80 years, admired daily and never once questioned. What defeated him at last was not a cleverer thief or a better detective. It was one person who had been taught to look carefully at ordinary things, and who looked at the boring rock everyone else had stopped seeing, and asked the plain question that no one had asked, "Why is that there?" Almost everything that stays hidden in this life stays hidden that way, not because it is out of sight, because it is dull, and we have all agreed to stop looking at it. So we will leave you tonight with a question, and we do read every answer. What is the thing in your own life or your own town that you pass every single day and have long since stopped actually looking at, and what might you see in it if you looked tomorrow as though for the first time? Tell us in the comments below. Light a lantern with us, subscribe if this story kept you company tonight, and we will see you down the line, where the next story is already waiting in the dark.